Shalom Havarim, James Trim here. Today I want to talk to you about the Old Syriac, Aramaic version of the four Gospels and how they fit into the Hebrew and Aramaic origin of the New Testament. Before we get going here though, I need to remind everybody to please donate to support these videos. We must raise $650 in the next 24 hours from the time of the making of this video. Donations have been very low, and at this point we must raise $650 by the end of the day tomorrow to prevent our bank account from plummeting into the negative and starting a cascade of returned items and fees, and nobody wants that. So if you can possibly help us out, you can donate by sending donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org or by clicking on the donate link in the video description. I also want to ask everybody to please remember to like these videos, like today's video, subscribe to this channel, and click that notification bell so that you'll get notifications when new videos come out. I can't speak English. And that's absolutely free service, no charge to subscribe to the channel. And then also please let us know what you think in the comments and participate in the discussions in the comments. All of these things are things that the YouTube algorithm looks at to decide which videos to recommend to new viewers. By the way, our like to view ratio is huge. It's very, very high. So help us keep that up, and that gets us recommended to new viewers by YouTube, and that helps us spread the word. And also, please share these videos with your friends. Share them email, share them on social media, Facebook, Twitter. Share them in Facebook groups that are relevant, have to do with relevant topics, obviously. Don't go spamming unrelated groups with it, but share it to your related groups. All right, and share it on your personal page. Okay, let's get going here. As usual, this video has handouts. The handouts today really just have some of the information from the academic sources that we're going to quote. And academic sources are always secondary sources. Of course, the primary sources are, for example, the text itself. And I assure you, I have spent 35 years at least studying this this particular text. Also, I talk generally about the Hebrew and Aramaic origin of the New Testament. Of course, the Tanakh was written primarily in Hebrew, but partially in Aramaic. The book of Daniel, much of it is written in Aramaic. Parts of Ezra are written in Aramaic. So we have Aramaic portions of the Tanakh. So it would not be problematic if the so-called New Testament, or the Ketuvim Netzarim, the writings of the Nazarenes, commonly known as the New Testament, were written also some in Hebrew and some in Aramaic. And the Aramaic language is very closely related to the Hebrew language. Hebrew and Aramaic are written in the same 22-letter alphabet. The Syriac dialect of Aramaic is generally written in a cursive style script rather than the letters that we're generally familiar with in Hebrew, but can be written in the same letter style that we use to write Hebrew. And the Aramaic language has much of the same vocabulary, at least the same three-letter verbal roots. Many of them are shared in Hebrew and Aramaic. They are cognate languages. They use much of the same grammar. In fact, they are so similar that the book of Daniel flows without notice from Hebrew to Aramaic and then back later to Hebrew again with no delineation, no indication that it's switching languages, other than the fact that if you're reading it in the original language, you'll see that you'll go from Hebrew and suddenly you'll be reading Aramaic, and later you'll be reading Hebrew. I like to say, to compare Hebrew and Aramaic, they're kind of almost as like Spanish and Portuguese for anybody that's familiar with those two languages. So they're very, very similar. And if you're looking at an Aramaic text that's a translation of a Hebrew text, you can, unless it's the Targums, which are paraphrases, but if it's a literal Aramaic translation, for example, the Peshitta Tanakh, if you're looking at the Peshitta Aramaic, Syriac Aramaic translation of the Tanakh, you can see the Hebrew text behind it very clearly. And much more so than if you're looking at the Greek Septuagint, looking at the Hebrew behind it. Because Greek and Hebrew have very little relationship to one another. They're not even written in the same direction. Hebrew is written right to left, and Greek and Latin and such are written in English or left to right. They don't use the same grammar or anything. They have very little in common. They're both languages. They have that in common. But Hebrew and Aramaic have a lot in common. So it makes very little difference in the Hebrew and Aramaic origin of the New Testament, whether we're talking about Hebrew evidence or Aramaic evidence. And in fact, so be aware of that. So if the Gospels, the four Gospels, were originally written in Hebrew rather than Aramaic, for example, then nonetheless an ancient Aramaic text would give us good insight into the original Hebrew, much more so than the Greek. And parts or all of the Gospels could theoretically have been written in Aramaic. Okay? Aramaic is also a Jewish language. It's the language of the Talmud. It's the language of the Targums. It's the language of the Zohar. And as I said, it's the language of portions even of the Tanakh. All right, so what is the Old Syriac? So the Old Syriac is going to first page of our handouts here. By the way, the handouts, there's a PDF link, a link to a PDF file in the video description where you can follow along some of these academic references that we're going to make. The Old Syriac is an ancient Aramaic version of the four Gospels. It was widely used until it was eclipsed by the Peshitta version of the Gospels in the late 5th or early 6th centuries. So complete was this eclipse that the version was totally lost until its recovery in the 19th century. Even now, it's only represented by 2 manuscripts. And when I say that, very recently, like maybe a month or 2 ago, it was announced that another page of the Old Syriac a manuscript was found, a manuscript that had been reused, and they were able to use technology to look at the text behind that was originally written on the manuscript. They found a page of it was a page of Luke from the Old Syriac. However, it was a 10th century text. So it didn't completely disappear until at least the 10th century, but that was quite an anomaly. So we do have one other witness to the text, but it's just one page of Luke, and it's from the 10th century. But let's talk about the 2 primary manuscripts. Now, they both are missing a lot of pages, but between the 2 of them overlaid, we have 95% of the gospel text. 5% is missing. And unfortunately, the manuscript that was recently discovered, which was only 1 page of Luke, wasn't a portion that we didn't already have. Okay, so the first manuscript was obtained from the monastery of St. Mary Diapora in the valley of the Natron Lakes in Egypt in 1842. It was not until 1858 that Dr. William Curiton identified and published the text. The manuscript is called the Curetonian or Codex Syriacus Curetonius, and it was cataloged as British Museum ad number 14451, and it's generally dated to the 5th century. By the way, in the 1980s, there was another scholar. It was actually in 1985. It was Dr. Daniel McConaughey. He discovered a missing page of this text and of this actual manuscript, and he photographed it and documented it, and so supplemented a little bit more to the material that we do have. What's really interesting about Dr. Daniel McConaughey, he was a student, by the way, of author Vebus, I'm not sure how you pronounce the name, who we'll quote later, big Syriac scholar and Aramaic scholar, and he was a student of his, and he was convinced that, in fact, the New Testament was originally written in Aramaic, and he was convinced that, and he wrote articles about this, and he was also convinced that the Peshitta and Old Syriac were descendants of that original Aramaic. Okay, the second manuscript was discovered by Agnes Smith Lewis, interestingly a female scholar in the 19th century, a rare thing, and at St. Catherine's Monastery, on the traditional site of Mount Sinai in 1892. This manuscript is called the Syriac Sinaitic or Codex Syriacus Sinaiticus, and its catalog is Mount Sinai Syriac manuscript number 30, and it's generally dated to the 4th century. So the two manuscripts have some variances from each other, and then each of them occasionally agrees with the Peshitta against the other. However, this is far more common for the Curetonian manuscript. Neither manuscript is complete, but as I said, between the two of them, we have 95% of the text of the 4 Gospels, and unfortunately, we do not have any of the Old Syriac for the post-Gospels portion, the emissaries or the Acts and the Epistles. We just don't have it, and we do have some clues to where we could find it, or not find it, but get bits and pieces of it, if you will. One is that the ancient Syriac church fathers, they tended, when they quoted the New Testament, at least when they quoted the Gospels, their quotations from the Gospels have a tendency to agree with the Old Syriac against the Peshitta, and so that makes makes it possible to look at their quotations of the epistles, for example, and Acts, for clues as to the Old Syriac reading of those texts. Also, the Old Syriac is a Western type text. In fact, the Western type text used to be called the Syro-Latin text because it agreed with the Old Syriac and the Old Latin. And the primary witness to the Western type text of the Gospels, at least, is Codex D. There are 3 text types, and the Western text is, as I said, is one of the oldest. It's arguably the oldest. I argue that it's the oldest, and it is the language, or is the text type of the oldest ancient versions, the Old Latin and the Old Syriac, and it is also has a characteristic of having more Semitisms than the traditional Greek text, the Alexandrian and Byzantine type texts. So we'll do a whole video on the Western type text in the future, but we can certainly then look to the Western type text of the post-Gospels portion in the Old Latin and in the Greek Western text type manuscripts in coordination with these quotations from the Syriac church fathers to get a view of the Old Syriac text of the post-Gospels portion. All right, let's turn to our next handout. This is very important. The Peshitta is a revision of the Old Syriac. Okay, so you may have heard of the Peshitta text, and there's a whole faction out there called Peshitta primacy that are convinced that the Peshitta is itself directly the original perfectly preserved text of the New Testament. And the Masoretic text, if you will, of the New Testament. Now, I don't think the Masoretic text is that, but that's what, I mean, a comparison to how rabbinic Jews might look at the Masoretic text is how they would look at the Peshitta. Now, the Peshitta, in my opinion, is a descendant of the original Aramaic text. Unfortunately, part of that process of it being a descendant has been that it was revised to more closely agree with the Byzantine type, the later Byzantine type Greek texts. So, quoting author Vubis is the way his name is spelled. I've heard that it's pronounced Vebus. He was a great Aramaic scholar at the University of Chicago, and probably the world's leading expert in his field at the time. As I said, he was the teacher of Daniel McConaughey. I will also say that I have inside word that the late Arthur Vubis did in fact believe that the Old Syriac was a descendant of the original Aramaic text of the Gospels, or an original Aramaic text of the Gospels. And realize when I say that, and I talk about an original Aramaic text, that could either mean an actual original Aramaic text, or the oldest original Aramaic text, i.e. translated from an even older, more original Hebrew text, but therefore a cognate language very much in common. Okay. So here's what he writes in his book, Early Versions of the New Testament, Manuscript Studies by Arthur Vubis, or Vebus, 1954, pages 97 through 98. Now, while I said he believed the Old Syriac was a descendant of the original, by the way, he never published that in his lifetime. That's salacious information that I have through the grapevine. Okay. So he writes, the Peshitta is not a new translation, but a revision of the Old Syriac version. ... As the result of this revision, digressions were eliminated, additions removed, omissions supplemented, and peculiarities retouched. Through this process, the Peshitta lost its former singularities and variants, which were much cherished and so deeply rooted in Syriac textual traditions. After this process, the text assumed a wholly new complexion, conforming more or less to the Greek. This distinguishes the ... This distinguishes the Peshitta from the Old Syriac. Its back is turned on the ancient and endearing traditions, and its face is decidedly turned towards the Greek form. ... Many idiomatic expressions found in the Old Syriac particularly the conjunctive construction over against the use of the infinitive and the predilection towards the nominal sentence, have been modified and adapted more to the Greek, but much of the idiomatic phraseology was still retained. Okay, so he's telling us that the Peshitta was a revision of the Old Syriac Aramaic text, and the Old Syriac text was basically revised towards greater agreement with the Greek text, and that text is what we call the Peshitta, that revised text. Sir Frederick Kenyon, in his book Handbook of Textual Criticism of the New Testament, in 1951, on page 164, he writes this, and I'm going to replace terminology that he used that became obsolete. He used a term for the Western type text, and for the Byzantine type text it was the same thing, but they used a different, there was a different terminology in use in his time, and so I have in brackets inserted Western type and Byzantine type where they belong. Okay, he, referring to the Peshitta redactor, must have used Greek manuscripts of a different family from that which is represented by the Old Syriac. This Old Syriac, as we have seen, belongs to the Western type, agreeing mainly with Codex D and with the Old Latin, and often also with the codices Aleph and B, while the Peshitta arranges itself rather with authorities of the Byzantine type. Just know that in textual criticism it is well known that Byzantine type texts are late Greek texts compared to Alexandrian and Western type texts. Okay. One thing I want to note here also is that from the Peshitta premises, I hear sometimes that the claim, in fact, they used to refer to it as the old scratch, in attacking me for talking about the Old Syriac back many, many years ago in some of the forums where we were talking about Aramaic origins. So they would often argue that it was that the Peshitta was the original, and that the Old Syriac was a translation from Greek. Now, that's so problematic for so many reasons, but it's very clear that the Old Syriac and the Peshitta are part of the same textual tradition. One's a revision of the other for sure, if anyone just simply looks at the two texts. And proof of this is in a Peshitta manuscript called Codex Philips, 1388. It's a 5th to 6th century manuscript of the four Gospels. So it's one of the older Peshitta manuscripts. But it, even though it's a manuscript of the Peshitta, it has many readings that depart from the Peshitta and agree with the Old Syriac. So it's very clear when you see that some of the oldest Peshitta manuscripts retain some Old Syriac readings, that they are part of the same Syriac Aramaic textual tradition. So whenever I talk about Aramaic origins of the New Testament in reference to the Old Syriac and the Peshitta, the first thing that I hear, or one thing that I hear regularly, is it's the wrong kind of Aramaic. It's Edessan Aramaic. It's Syriac Aramaic. And it therefore it's the wrong dialect. It can't be the, it's not a Jewish dialect of Aramaic. It's not a Western dialect of Aramaic that was used in by Jews at the time in Judea and Galilee. It's an Eastern dialect of Aramaic. It's more like the later dialect of the Babylonian Talmud, but not entirely. It is the wrong kind of Aramaic. Now, there's an important fact that is a response, first of all, to the claim that it's the wrong kind of Aramaic, and two, It also supports the fact that the Old Syriac is a more primitive, more Jewish text than the Peshitta Aramaic. So, quoting from Matthew Black in his book, An Aramaic Approach to the Gospel and Acts, 3rd edition, this is Appendix A, page 281. By the way, he admittedly depends heavily on the 19th century analysis by Burkitt of the Old Syriac, but he was well qualified to analyze the validity of that, of Burkitt's work. And he wrote, a number of linguistic anomalies in the Old Syriac Gospels cannot be explained in terms of Edessan Syriac. Many of these forms and uses are regular in Western Aramaic. And in fact, in his analysis, Black finds, in Appendix A, he finds at least 79 instances where the Old Syriac text of the four Gospels contains elements of Western Aramaic that are unacceptable in Eastern Aramaic, that are clearly, I would argue, this is clearly because these are artifacts of the Western Aramaic text from which the Old Syriac was drawn, the original Jewish Aramaic. And I say original, there may have been an even more original Hebrew behind this, but from an original Aramaic version that was a Western dialect Jewish Aramaic version that served as the basis and was for the Old Syriac Edessan Aramaic text. And because these elements exist in the Old Syriac, not the Peshitta, the Old Syriac therefore is more directly connected to the ancient Western Jewish Aramaic version of the Gospels than is the Peshitta. There are also many Aramaic elements. There are also many Jewish elements that are preserved in the Old Syriac version that are not to be found in the Peshitta and in the Greek text, that are uniquely Jewish aspects. For example, in Matthew chapter 9, verse 18, the Old Syriac doesn't say that a certain ruler came and fell down before Yeshua, but that a certain ruler of their synagogue came and fell down. And then in Matthew chapter 18, verse 17, the Old Syriac, when it says, tell it to the assembly, in the older text of the Old Syriac, Sinaiticus, it says the word for assembly there is not the word that is normally used for church or assembly in the Old Syriac, elsewhere in the Peshitta. It's not edta, or edat, if you will. It is knessetah, or knesset, which is the Aramaic word that would be used here because, and we did a whole video on this in the past, the passage here in Matthew chapter 18, in chapter 18 verse 16, is referencing back the law of witnesses in Deuteronomy 19:25, which means that if you look in the context of Deuteronomy 19, what this is talking about, and like I said, we did a video about this in the past, what this is talking about is the Beit Din, the assembly of judges, not the General Assembly of Israel. And so that's the appropriate Aramaic word to be used there. Then also in Matthew 23 verse 5, where the Peshitta says, and they widened their tefillin, the Old Syriac says that they widen the straps of their tefillin. So that's kind of interesting. In fact, going on then to Luke chapter 1 verse 39. Luke 1:39, the Old Syriac says, and went up quickly to a mountain, to a city of Judea. Whereas the Peshitta says, and went quickly to a mountain, to a city of Judea. Now, what's the difference between went up and went? Well, in the Jewish idiom, whenever one goes from somewhere else to Judea, or from somewhere else to Jerusalem especially, but from somewhere else to Judea, they are said to ascend, to go up. It doesn't matter whether they're traveling north, south, east, or west to get there. They're said to go up to Jerusalem or go up to Judea. So this is the correct, if you will, Jewish dialect found in the Old Syriac. In Luke chapter 2, verse 22, the Peshitta Aramaic has that Miriam and Yeshua, when they went to the temple, that they went for the days of their purification, for of their purification, which agrees with the Greek. But in fact, it is only in Jewish law, in Leviticus chapter 12, verses 1 through 8, the mother who is undergoing a purification ritual. And so the Old Syriac more correctly has, from a Jewish Torah observant, Torah understanding perspective, it says days of her purification, not days of their purification. So it expresses a awareness of Jewish law. Luke chapter 23, verse 2. Luke 23, verse 2. Here the Peshitta and the Greek says that he is a king, comma, the Messiah. But in the Old Syriac he says that he is King Messiah. And of course, anyone who's familiar, in Jewish circles knows the traditional Jewish phrase King Messiah. So that's also a more Jewish reading. Now I'm just scratching the surface. There are more and more and more of these than I can cite in this video. John chapter 9 verse 16, when Yeshua heals the blind man with clay, by making clay, and he's accused of violating the Sabbath. It says he keeps not the Sabbath, and then it has an additional phrase, and he made clay. That's not found in the Greek. It's not found in the Peshitta. It's only found in the Old Syriac, and it is directly a reference to the halacha concerning Shabbat and the things that are prohibited on Shabbat, because making clay is one of the things that's specifically prohibited in Jewish law in the halacha concerning what constitutes violating Sabbath in Jewish law. The Old Syriac also has a tendency to agree whenever the Tanakh, books of the Tanakh are quoted. The Old Syriac has a tendency to agree with the Masoretic text, or at least the traditional Hebrew text. I won't say the Masoretic text, it didn't exist yet, but the Hebrew text against the Greek, and oftentimes the Peshitta. For example, in Matthew chapter 4, verse 4, this is in the temptation, quoting Deuteronomy 8:3, the Old Syriac agrees with the Masoretic text. Looking at my notes here, where the Masoretic text has the sacred name Yud-He-Vav-He, Yahweh, the Old Syriac in Matthew chapter 4, verse 4 has Maryah, which is what Lord, which is what the Peshitta Tanakh has for Yud He Vav He for the sacred name. And it is in agreement with the Deuteronomy 8:3, not only in the Masoretic text, but the Peshitta Tanakh precisely. However, the Peshitta has Allah, or God, in agreement with the Greek New Testament and the Septuagint of that passage. Now, I can't look at all of these. I'm just looking at some highlights because there are too many quotations from the Tanakh. Matthew chapter 22, verse 37, quoting Deuteronomy 6:5, the Shema, the Old Syriac agrees with the Masoretic text, whereas the Peshitta does not, and Greek Matthew does not. Okay. There are more, but there is so much to talk about, and we may make more videos in the future, or maybe I'll write a book on this at some point, or an additional book. I've written a book on it in the past called The Hebrew and Aramaic Origin of the New Testament that has some of this information in it. There are also, and I'm going to have to breeze through some of this, we won't have examples here, but there are places where the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called Synoptic Gospels because many of the phrases are virtually identical. The words and phrases in the narrative material and in the sayings. But sometimes there is just a slight variance, either a word or phrase is just a little bit different, and there are a number of instances where that difference between the Greek text of Matthew, Mark, and Luke can be traced back or to an original Aramaic phrase or word that was either ambiguous or a scribal error where maybe two letters were flipped, or something of that nature, where one word was misread as another, and that created the variance. And there are many places where that takes place, where the Aramaic text that we do see in the Old Syriac explains that difference, and in some cases the difference either doesn't occur at all because the ambiguous Aramaic word appears in the Synoptics in the Old Syriac, or the words that looked alike and were misread either by a scribe in the Aramaic tradition at some point. Well, in that case, yes, because we would see that in the Old Syriac, accounts for the difference, and we can see it in the Old Syriac. There are also places where there are ambiguous words, ambiguous Aramaic words that were apparently mistranslated by the Greek translator, and which created a awkward misunderstanding in the Greek text that makes much more sense in the Old Syriac. Some of these also exist in the Peshitta, because the Peshitta is simply a revision of the Old Syriac. A couple of examples was, for example, when Yeshua sits to dine in the home of Simon the leper. The word for leper in Aramaic, garavah, the same consonants, slightly different vowels, but the same consonants, and ancient Aramaic was written without consonants, as was without vowels, without written vowels. The word leper could also mean a jar maker or jar merchant, and in that account, a woman takes a fancy alabaster jar of pistachio oil, or very pure oil, but in Aramaic it's pistachio oil. The Greek has, again, this is a case where the Greek has misread the Aramaic, and the Greek word for very pure that's taken to mean very pure is actually a transliteration of the Aramaic word pistica, meaning pistachio. Um, so there are many. That's one example. So he wasn't in the home of a leper because the Torah would prohibit socializing with lepers, other than, of course, to heal them. He was at the home of Simon the jar merchant, not Simon the leper. Also, when he talks about a camel going through the eye of a needle, the word for camel in Aramaic is gamlah, but gamlah can also mean jar merchant. It comes from a root meaning to bear a burden. So I said jar merchant. I meant a large rope or a gangplank for a ship, something that bears a burden, or a beam. Okay, in this case, Yeshua was actually talking about a large rope not going through the eye of a needle, making much more sense. And in fact, the ancient Armenian translation has a word in Armenian that can only mean large rope. Okay, again, we've got to proceed in the interest of time here. There are scribal errors, places where the Greek translator appears to have misread an Aramaic word, or perhaps a scribal error took place in the Aramaic tradition before the Greek translator got to it. That points to the not only the Aramaic origin, but the Old Syriac's relationship to that Hebrew and Aramaic origin. There are puns, word plays, and alliteration that appear in the Aramaic text that point to it being more original, at least, than the Greek. We did this is very important. The Old Syriac holds a unique relationship to the Hebrew text of the Deuteronomy Hebrew manuscript. And this is very, very important, and it's very unique. And we'll put a link to the discussion we did on the Deuteronomy Hebrew version of Matthew. But the fact is that when you look at there are a number of readings between the Deuteronomy Hebrew version of Matthew and the Old Syriac Aramaic version of Matthew that agree against all other versions. And sometimes even there are apparent grammatical errors or grammatical anomalies that appear in the same place in both of them. I'll put a link in the video description to the discussion we did on the Deuteronomy Hebrew version of Matthew. But when you're looking at the Old Syriac Aramaic version of Matthew and you're comparing it to the Deuteronomy Hebrew version of Matthew, to me it looks very much like the Aramaic is a translation of the Hebrew. And that's very important because the Deuteronomy Hebrew manuscript of Matthew comes to us from the Middle Ages, from the 1500s, in fact. And so the Renaissance, even, not necessarily the Middle Ages, but it's the Hebrew version of Matthew goes back to Europe in the 1500s, and yet it has this strong relationship to an Aramaic version of Matthew that goes back to the Middle East, to the 4th century. Okay, I know we covered a lot of material today, but the takeaway from this is that the Old Syriac version of the four Gospels is a more primitive Aramaic text than the Peshitta Aramaic text of the Gospels. It has a close relationship to the Deuteronomy Hebrew version of Matthew that we don't find in the Peshitta. It has many Jewish elements in it, many nuances that display an awareness of Jewish law that are absent from the Peshitta as well as the Greek. The Tanakh quotes tend to agree with the Masoretic text, even when the Peshitta does not, and certainly when the Greek does not. There is a tremendous amount of internal evidence that the Aramaic text underlies the Greek text, and especially the Greek Western type text of Codex D and the Old Latin as well. There are many Western at least 79 instances of artifacts of Western Aramaic preserved in the Old Syriac, which implies to us that the Old Syriac is actually a Syriac version of the Jewish Western Aramaic version of the Gospels of the Second Temple era. And I'll just add something to that. This kind of dialect revision, okay? It's like, for example, if somebody took a document that was written in Spanish, like they use in Spain, or I'll do it the other way around. Let's say that they took a document that was written in Mexican Spanish, and they published a version of it in Spain, and they upgraded the dialect. I won't even say upgraded because I'm not trying to give value to the two dialects, but they changed the dialect a little bit to make it the Spanish that's spoken in Spain, and they published the same book in Spain. Okay. We see something similar to this. For example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found Hebrew manuscripts of portions, at least, pages of Hebrew manuscripts of the the apocryphal book of the Wisdom of Ben Sirach. We also found copies in the early Middle Ages in the Cairo Geniza. We found pages, and some of them we have, only in one or the other, but we have about 2/3 of the text of the book all together in Hebrew. Of course, we have I don't want to get too much into Ben Sirach here, but we have the dialect is a little bit different. So it appears that somebody upgraded the dialect or revised the dialect of the version that we find in the Cairo Geniza to a more modern, to that time period, dialect of Hebrew. If I said Aramaic on any of that, Ben Sirach we're talking about Hebrew. Okay. So it's not unusual then that we would see a Syriac Aramaic edition of the four Gospels published in the form of the Old Syriac, and that the dialect is simply a Syriac dialect version of a Western Jewish Aramaic version of the four Gospels that existed and was used by the Nazarenes, the original Jewish followers of Yeshua, during the Second Temple era. So the Old Syriac is a Syriac version of the four Gospels based upon an older Aramaic, Western Aramaic dialect Jewish version of the four Gospels, and that the Peshitta version of the Gospels is a revision of the Old Syriac. And the Old Syriac then also has a unique relationship to the Hebrew text that we find in the Deuteronomic Hebrew version of Matthew. So the Old Syriac is extremely important to our understanding of the original Hebrew and Aramaic text of the four Gospels. And I can't emphasize that enough. Okay, I want to ask everybody again to please donate to support these videos. We are facing a super financial crunch. In the next 24 hours, we need to raise $650 in order to clear bills hitting our account. Things have been financially tight. I just had to, a couple of days ago, pick up $250 worth of prescriptions for my wife. Many of you know she is disabled, chronically ill, and suffers chronic pain, and I'm her caretaker, and I had it was necessary to pick up these prescriptions. And so we are $650 in the hole tomorrow night if we can't raise those funds in the next 24 hours to clear our account Monday night. All right, so please Click on the donate link in the video description or send donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. Where else are you going to get this kind of material, this unique, I think very informative videos? And also, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, click that notification bell. Let us know what you think in the comments, and participate in the comments section. And don't forget to share this video with your friends in relevant Facebook groups, or in your Facebook page, on social media, Twitter, and other social media accounts, and email to your friends, and just share with your friends, and help us get out to new viewers. All right, until next time, everybody, shalom.